Thank you very much to come here and to share with you guys. Super nervous right now. Yeah, so I am here to share about the first decade of the IGNTP. I wanted to do an examination of the IGNTP's cataloged correspondence. And so what kind of led me to want to explore this topic for this conference is we have at the CNTPS in New Orleans, we have all of the old administrative files from the central office of the IGNTP that was originally based at University of Chicago. And there's a whole bunch of materials here. So we got some of the original copies of the TR that they used to collate against. We've got collations that were done by hand. And then we've got all of the letters that were passed amongst the members, and we also have boxes of index cards with patristic quotations of the Gospel of Luke. And so ever since I started working at the CNTPS, I have been looking for an excuse to stop what I'm working on and to go look at some of this stuff. And last summer, Elijah Hickson came with the CSNPM to digitize all of these files. And so I offered to help in any way I could. And so Elijah needed me to take all the staples out and then restaple it. And so I got the opportunity to read through a lot of these documents as the process slowed down, but we had to move fast. Elijah needed to scan all of them. So I didn't get to read them very well, but I got a good idea of some of the juicy stuff that was in here. And so then just a couple of months later, found out that the Birmingham Colloquium, part of the theme this year, was on the IGNTP. So lo and behold, another excuse to stop everything that I'm doing and spend some more time looking through these files. And so one of the main questions I had, I wasn't super familiar with the IGNTP before I looked at these files. And so in preparation for the presentation, I did a little reading, and like was mentioned in the last presentation, the initial goal to publish the Gospel of Luke was 1954. And so the goal keeps getting pushed back very early in the days of the project. And so in order to keep the scope kind of down and just to itch my curiosity, I just wondered what in the world happened just the first 10 years that prevented the IGNTP from accomplishing their goals, from finishing the Gospel of Luke in a timely manner. And so conversations begin much earlier than 1948, but several people have already written pretty extensively detailing the history of how the IGNTP got started. And so I really just want to start focusing in the letters in 1948, and that's really where the majority of the letters pick up anyhow. And so with that, we will just jump right in. And so in May of 1948, Merrill Parvis wrote to G.D. Kilpatrick, responding to Kilpatrick's earlier letter from 1947, indicating that he had spoken with Lightfoot and the rest of the British committee about Parvis's plan to create a new critical apparatus. Parvis mentions that his plans are still tentative, considering he just completed his PhD and his son was recently born. However, Parvis notes that if this project were to become an international cooperation, committees would need to be formed soon, and those committees would need to meet with one another. In October, Kilpatrick sent a letter on behalf of the British committee to Parvis and 11 other American New Testament textual scholars, proposing that the Americans and British committees cooperate to produce a new critical apparatus to the Greek New Testament. Ernest Caldwell responded to Kilpatrick's letter in November. In this letter, Caldwell mentions that Kilpatrick's letter was discussed at a conference on the critical apparatus in Chicago on October 22nd and 23rd. The American Textual Criticism seminar members accepted the British proposal for cooperation, and the University of Chicago took institutional responsibility for this undertaking. Caldwell also provided a list in this letter highlighting the points of agreement and disagreement with the British committee's plans. Caldwell notes that this list demonstrates the need for both committees to meet soon and to plan for this project. Caldwell wrote Kilpatrick in December, inviting him to visit for a short period in America to discuss the details of the cooperation between the Americans and the British. Caldwell proposes a few weeks surrounding December 27th through the 30th, the Society of Biblical Literature meeting dates in New York. Kilpatrick responded that he could make such a trip, but it wouldn't be until April of 1949, where he would stay for at least a month. In 1949, Parvis wrote to Kilpatrick in January, updating him of what occurred in the December SBL meeting. The American Textual Criticism Seminar created the American Editorial Board and the American Executive Committee for the project. Kilpatrick visited America by boat, arriving in April to discuss the plans for the project and stayed until May 13th. Some details are ironed out during this meeting, including the setting the completion goal of 1954. Kilpatrick wrote Parvis in June, letting him know how things have gone since he returned to Oxford. Kilpatrick found out upon arrival that his request from Oxford for the project, such as hiring an assistant, had been deferred until Kilpatrick's arrival to the faculty of Oxford the next term. In addition, Kilpatrick's request for an early meeting of the Critical Greek New Testament Committee had been denied, and the group would not meet until June 21st. Finally, in July, Parvis wrote a letter to Floyd D. Filson containing Kilpatrick's summary of this meeting on June 21st. At this meeting, the British committee agreed to the proposal to establish an international executive committee for the project. In July, Metzger wrote a letter to Alan P. Whitgren explaining that Kurt Aland had contacted him about the project. Aland was interested in contributing to the project as the editor of the Theologische Literatur Zeitung and as a member of Berlin Academy's Kirchenvatters Commission. But apparently up until this point, neither committee were completely decided on who would do what work in the project. For instance, in December, Metzger wrote to Caldwell that they should no longer consider beginning the project with the Book of Revelation. Caldwell agreed and noted that this would be a central topic of discussion at the American Executive Meeting that year. In 1950, on July 3rd, Bruce Metzger is sent abroad from July 3rd to August 3rd to meet with scholars concerning the project. He spends half of his time in England meeting with members of the British Committee to establish closer connections between the Americans and the British. He spends the other half meeting with various scholars in France, Switzerland, Germany, and Holland. These meetings involved investigating the ability of manuscript material and the possibility of collaboration. Following Metzger's return, the American Committee held a meeting on September 23rd and discussed planning a meeting between the American and British committees in Bermuda between January and March 1951. Might be a good location for the next Birmingham Colloquium. In addition, the American Committee expressed interest in formalizing a relationship with the Kirchenvatters Commission of the Berlin Academy at the request of Kurt Aland. However, they were clear that the British Committee must approve any association with this organization. The next meeting of the American Committee was held on October 28th. At this meeting, it was announced that the Rockefeller Foundation would no longer provide any more financial assistance and that their present grant would expire on March 31st, 1951. Despite this, the committee planned to appeal to John D. Rockefeller Jr. for a grant of $100,000 over a 10-year period. They also planned to ask the major denominations in America to contribute $5,000 annually. Finally, the project's name is also changed from the International Project to establish a new critical apparatus to the Greek New Testament. That would be a mouthful today, to the International New Testament Manuscript Projects. The INTMP doesn't quite roll off the tongue like IGNTP. So in 1951, Ernest Caldwell sent a letter to the rest of the American Editorial Board in January, suggesting the formation of an international executive committee to help expedite communication between the American and British committees, to develop general policies and coordinate the programs of all the groups. His original suggestion is that the committee might be made up of 3 British members, 1 German member, 1 French member, 1 Roman Catholic member, and 5 American members. In addition to these, Merrill Parvis could serve as the executive secretary. Caldwell also suggested that Kurt Aland, Father Bonifacius Fisher, and Canon Maurice Brieri might fill some of the 3 of those positions. Caldwell also proposed to send Parvis on a trip to meet with the British committee and the scholars named above, to meet with them and explain and discuss this proposal. Parvis was given a grant of $1,600 by the Rockefeller Foundation to take this trip by boat in February. But while in Oxford, Parvis learned of some of the troubles that G.D. Kilpatrick faced in facilitating work for the project. This trouble came mainly from the chairman of the British Committee, R.H. Lightfoot. Apparently, Lightfoot had blocked all attempts by Kilpatrick to obtain funding from Oxford University and the British Academy for even simple things such as hiring a secretary or buying office supplies. He also learned that Lightfoot prevented discussion from being had at any of the meetings. Supposedly, Lightfoot assumed that everyone's minds were already made up on issues by the time the meeting was held, and so they only took time to vote on these issues, and no time for discussion was made available. However, while Parvis was in Oxford, Lightfoot ultimately resigned as chairman and from the committee altogether. His resignation was connected to the American Committee's request for an official relationship with the Kirchenwachters Commission. This request caused great distress amongst the British Committee, and Parvis indicated the British Committee almost withdrew from the project entirely because of this. The first reason for this distress is that some, such as Lightfoot, feared that the Americans were packing a policymaking body that could outvote the British Committee, effectively taking control of the project. According to Parvis, this fear is why Lightfoot resigned after serving just 3 years as chairman. The second reason is that many feared the Kirchenwachters Commission was a communist propaganda front, and that any support from the British Academy and the Oxford Press would be lost if an official relationship were created with the Kirchenwachters Commission. Also, Allen had sent a letter in December of 1950 to Professor Kalle, a German refugee in Oxford, that did not help. This letter supposedly painted the British Committee and G.D. Kilpatrick in a bad light and asked Kalle to pressure the British Committee to speed up sanctioning this official relationship. So instead of an official cooperation with any organization on the continent or the creation of a continental committee, it was decided at this meeting that the project would only work with individual scholars on the continent. These invited scholars would not be given a spot on any policymaking committee, but could help in other capacities. The British Committee met in October and elected H.I. Bell as the new chairman of the committee. Several other important decisions were made at this meeting. First, they formally accepted the motion to establish a general executive committee of the International Greek New Testament Project, which would consist of the American Executive Committee and the newly created British Subcommittee. The name of the project was changed to the name we now know today, the International Greek New Testament Project. Finally, the decision was made to create a general editorial board consisting of the American Editorial Board, the British Critical Greek New Testament Committee, Kurt Aland, Father Bonifacius Fisher, and Canon Maurice Brerier. The task appointed to this committee was to receive and pass judgment on the manuscript before submission to the press. In the wake of this meeting, Parvis sent letters to the American Editorial Board members alerting them to these decisions. Parvis also sent a letter to Kurt Aland in November, alerting him to his appointment to the General Editorial Board, as well as the confirmation of the American committees. Aland responded to Parvis in a letter in December, accepting the invitation and mentioning that he had not yet heard anything from Kilpatrick about the appointment. And so in 1952, now that both committees have finally agreed to create a general executive committee for the IGNTP, they formally planned a meeting of both the American and British committees. In anticipation of this meeting, the British committee held a meeting in March to fill the newly created subcommittee. This subcommittee was given full powers to act on behalf of the Critical Greek New Testament Committee while they met with the Americans. Finally, in a letter from Aland to Parvis in April, Aland mentions that some time ago, he received word from Kilpatrick concerning the appointment of Brerier, Fisher, and himself to the General Editorial Board. Parvis also sent a letter to Metzger alerting him that the dates of the first joint meeting between the American and British committees had been determined from June 14th to the 17th. At this meeting, the American Executive Committee and the British Subcommittee formally declared themselves the General Executive Committee of the International Greek New Testament Project. Over these 4 days, the General Executive Committee accomplished much planning. The members decided that meetings between the American and British committees should be attempted every 2 to 3 years, while allowing for voting on decisions through correspondence. In addition, the committee accepted the American proposal to establish a central office at the University of Chicago to keep up with the progress of the work and to facilitate communication. The project scope was defined as all Greek manuscripts to the 9th century, enough later Greek manuscripts to provide adequate representation of families, groups, and text types, and a limited number of later Greek manuscripts, which contain significant differences from the received text. Finally, a goal was set to have all the materials on Luke submitted to the central office in Chicago by September 30th, 1956. And so here's a couple of pictures I found in the files of the central office in Chicago, working with their microfilm readers with the lights off. Looks a lot like working on the computer now. In 1953, the Chicago Tribune published an article on March 8th, indicating that Kurt Aland is the second professor at the Evangelical Martin Luther University in Halle to go missing and is believed to have been arrested. Shortly after this article was published, Parvis wrote a letter signed by all the members of the American Committee to James B. Conant, the United States High Commissioner to West Germany. In this letter, Parvis explains who Aland is, his importance for the International Greek New Testament Project, and the committee urges Conant to secure the release of Aland. A similar letter is also sent on the same day, signed by every member of the General Executive Committee of the IGNTP. In addition, Kilpatrick wrote to Parvis, informing him that he was contacting British intelligence to gain information about Aland. Kilpatrick also suggests that instead of formal requests for Aland's release, they should resort to bribery and corruption to get Aland out. TC critics are hardcore. Kilpatrick is worried that formal requests would only increase Aland's value in the eyes of whoever is holding him. Finally, a word from Aland is received in a letter in December. Aland wrote to Parvis, letting him know what he's been up to since his release from prison, and thanks the committee for their part in his release. And it's at this year that the University of Chicago begins footing more and more of the bill as the American committees struggle to find financial support. The financial situation on the American side of things continues to worsen in 1954. Attempts at attaining grants continually fail, and in February, Parvis wrote to Metzger that Dean Loomer of the University of Chicago had just resigned and that Seward Hiltner had been named the acting dean until October 1st. After a conversation with Hiltner, Parvis believes that Hiltner will continue to ensure financial support from the university and may even provide extra help. However, in March, Parvis sends another letter to Metzger explaining that Hiltner has promised $5,000 for the next fiscal year, but that this may be the last financial help from the university. Then in June, Caldwell received a letter from R.W. Harrison, the vice president and dean of faculties at the University of Chicago. Harrison wrote to Caldwell to gain insight into the project and to suggest that the project be moved from Chicago to Emory, where Caldwell currently resides. Later in July, Caldwell received a letter from Lawrence A. Kempton, pointing out that the University of Chicago has recently assumed most of the project's financial burden without any fiscal or academic control. As a result, the University of Chicago fears they may continue to fund this project only for it to eventually be moved to Emory with Caldwell. In light of these concerns, Kempton asked Caldwell to specify what the committee intends to do with the project. Caldwell responded in July with a 2-page document spelling out what the committee intends. The committee intended to keep Parvis in his current role as secretary. The committee intended to move the project only if asked to leave, or if the University of Chicago ceases funding and funding must be sourced elsewhere. After finally reaching an agreement that the project had no plans to relocate and that the University of Chicago could be given a voice in the day-to-day administration in the project's office, Parvis visited London to propose these changes with the British committee. Parvis explained the financial difficulties of the American Committee and proposed that the University of Chicago be permitted to appeal for funding outside of the university and permission to administer those funds in the day-to-day affairs of the project at a meeting of the British Committee on November 12th. After discussing this proposal, the British Committee authorized Kilpatrick to draft a memorandum concerning this proposal. This memorandum reminded everyone that the project's materials would not belong to the University of Chicago and that the Oxford Press would be the sole publisher of the completed apparatus. Furthermore, the memorandum supported Parvis's role at the central office and expressed concerns about his job safety as he was not a tenured professor. Such an appointment would ease the British Committee's concerns over the project's leadership. And upon Parvis's return to the States, a meeting of the American Committee was held December 4th through the 5th, in which he summarized his meetings with the British Committee. Curiously, he briefly notes that the British Committee had gone on record as being opposed to any further attempts to cooperate with the American Bible Society to publish a new critical text. Finally, at this meeting, the committee also agreed with Caldwell that if no sizable amount of money could be secured for the project by the end of next year, the time schedule of the project should be reconsidered. In 1955, more information is found about the British involvement with the American Bible Society Critical Text Project. In a letter addressed to Parvis from Kilpatrick in January, Kilpatrick was approached by Eugene Nida, who proposed a committee of about 6 scholars drawn from both sides of the Atlantic, along with a $50,000 grant to create a new critical text. However, the British committee opposed being involved for 2 significant reasons. One was that a 3rd edition of the British and Foreign Bible Society's Greek New Testament had already been given the green light, and they weren't sure how the American Bible Society text would be an improvement upon this 3rd edition. The second reason is that the committee felt that such a text proposed by the American Bible Society would soon be rendered obsolete once they finished printing every edition of the critical apparatus for the IGNTP project. A letter from Parvis to Metzger in March showed that the situation at the University of Chicago only worsened. The new acting dean Philby had decided that all financial support for the project would be ceased by June 30th, 1955. However, Philby would keep Parvis on payroll until June 30th, 1956, and allow him to work anywhere he pleased on the project. However, the central office would be closed for good on June 30th, 1955. Therefore, the goal to have all the materials on Luke submitted is moved from 1956 to 1957. Parvis mentions in a letter to Metzger in May that he is moving to Emory on July 1st and that the project headquarters will now be located at Emory. In September, Metzger presented a report on the progress of the American section of the IGNTP at the 2nd International Conference on Patristic Studies that met at Christ Church, Oxford. In this report, Metzger notes that 191 Greek manuscripts have been collated, with 84 being checked and 45 recorded in a master file. In addition, 32 other Greek manuscripts were presently being collated. The Greek Lectionary Committee had collated 29 lectionaries and was in the process of collating 25 more. In 1956, the American Editorial Board held its first meeting at Emory on January 21st. Parvis makes a trip to England from August 4th to the 19th, and he shares the details about this journey at an American Executive Committee meeting on October 20th. However, there were no minutes or reports from any of these meetings in the files, only letters mentioning these meetings. So I wondered if moving to Emory had anything to do with that. Maybe they didn't keep up with the files as good, but most of the letters from this year continue to show that Parvis and the project are continually sending out and collecting microfilms from volunteers for the project. In 1957, Parvis wrote a letter to Allen in September mentioning conversations that they had had in person earlier that year at Utrecht and Oxford. In these conversations, Allen said that he had never received letters mentioning his appointment to the General Editorial Board. Parvis references the letter he sent to him on November 14th, 1951, as well as Allen's response accepting the position on December 10th. A little later in November, Allen responds to Parvis, acknowledging that he did receive and respond to Parvis's letters. However, he states that he did not think that the appointment was officially executed because he never received word from Kilpatrick. But a letter was found from Allen on April 1st, 1952, indicating that he did receive word from Kilpatrick about the appointment. Furthermore, in this letter in November, Allen wrote that he has requested from Caldwell a letter from the IGNTP to the Deutschen Academy der Wissenschaften proposing an official cooperation between the two. And that's really where the conversation ends between them and Allen in this first decade. But at the end of 1957, the year of the new goal came and went without any mention of missing this date or even updating the date. The financial situation continues to worsen in 1958. Parvis wrote to Metzger in March, notifying him that the project has already overdrawn the budget by almost $6,000, while estimating to spend another $12,000. The project had some money pledged for this year, but now they would need to raise $12,750.59 for the rest of the year. A follow-up letter in March from Parvis to Metzger reads that Caldwell decided to cut out all committee meetings and travel, while also cutting down staff as much as possible. In May, Metzger wrote to Parvis that a student had accused Alon on political grounds, and he was separated from his work in Berlin. Later, Metzger received word through the Greek epigrapher Klaffenbach of Berlin. Klaffenbach reported that Alon and his wife were not allowed to leave the town of Halle, and that no one from a capitalist country should attempt to help them, as it will only make matters worse. In August, Metzger wrote to Parvis, letting him know that he had heard that Alon and his wife had escaped East Berlin, but had to leave behind all of their belongings. Finally, Alon wrote to Parvis in October, reporting his relocation to Münster. Throughout this time, Parvis continued seeking financial aid, but is unsuccessful. Caldwell and Parvis attempted to organize an American Executive Committee meeting on November 8th, but all the members would have to pay for their own travel expenses. Because of this financial burden, the meeting is scrapped. Instead, the committee plans to meet during the SBL meeting in New York. Parvis wrote to Metzger in December, letting him know that this meeting would be held on December 29th in Parvis's hotel room. The IGNTP could not reach any of its goals to produce the volume of loot within the project's first decade. Several forces seem to be at play that contribute to this. The first is the lack of organization in the beginning. The committees were undecided if they would work on the same material or different books of the New Testament for a couple of years. Both committees did not meet to iron out the project details until 4 years into their cooperation. Once they did meet, the committees accomplished a lot. However, despite planning to meet every 2 to 3 years, they do not meet again at any point in this first decade. A second reason was the project's inability to maintain adequate funding. The initial grant from the Rockefeller Foundation dried up in the first 2 years. After this, the University of Chicago slowly took on more and more of the financial burden, but ceased to do so by 1955. As a result, the central office was closed and forced to move the year before the original goal was met. Staff was cut and meetings could not be organized. A third reason is that politics prevented international cooperation. Fear of the Americans taking control of the project and the Kirchen-Wachters Commission kept the project from cooperating with Kurt Alon in Germany in any official capacity. Likewise, no other organizations on the continent were included in this cooperation. Finally, the nature and scope of the work made it difficult to accomplish. Only volunteers with access to a microfilm reader could help contribute to the project in any way. Microfilms were mailed out, and the project would not hear from collators for months or years. I take the situation for granted as a reconciler for the Greek Paul project. Every semester, we have volunteer student transcribers, and we assign them 6 to 8 beautiful color images of manuscripts so they can access and read anywhere with an internet connection. And I stress out when I don't hear from them in a couple of weeks or see them check the box off in the Google Sheet, letting me know that they completed a transcription. I cannot imagine having to mail out one manuscript at a time, waiting 3 years to hear back from someone if they completed a collation. The fact that they completed the project at all is an enormous feat. Unfortunately, the IGNTP still would not finish loot for another 30 years. The rest of these letters could shed more light on what continued to delay the completion of the volume of loot. Thank you for the opportunity to share my findings from these letters, and happy 75th anniversary to the IGNTP.
Oh, what a really great and interesting, intriguing first paper. One question. We've got time for one question. We'll have lots of questions afterwards. We want all the different panel, but yeah.
Can I just make some comments? But I don't know if you're aware that Merrill Parvis' son, Paul Parvis, is a colleague of mine, and that he has some further information. And I can say while I was at Queen's, Kilpatrick's reputation was still known years after him. There are many ways of having a reputation, so I would say on that. But he was, I think, like R.H. Lightfoot's successor to the Dean Irons chair. And I'm not sure if Lightfoot was always happy with that succession. Kilpatrick, I think, was Canadian, so maybe that concern about a North American takeover might have some foundation there. I think he might have had a Birmingham link too early on in his ministry career. So all these circles come together. So there is more there. And I think the letters often represent the writers in the way they want to be represented.
And of course, there's lots of oral history about Allen as well. We ought to try and make sure that we keep the oral tradition going, but we want to thank you very much again.